Hey nerds, we are talking about the Orville New Horizons. We are going to talk about Season 3, Episode 1. We're going to give our spoiler-free review of the episode, and then we're going to get into a full spoiler breakdown of the episode, starting now. Welcome to the Nerd Soul Show. I am Nathan.
And I'm Colin.
Hey, I want to say, if you want to skip ahead to the spoiler section, you can. There's chapter information below. So this is the Orville season premiere after being away for several years now. I think the last episode was back in 2019 because of COVID, and also because apparently they left Fox and they are now on Hulu. So the spoiler-free logline for this episode is the crew deals with the aftermath of the Kaylon battle. All right, Colin, what did you think of this episode?
It was very surprising to me because my exposure to the Orville was through YouTube videos and through Fox promotions when I was watching TV. And it was seen as though it was, for a lot of reasons, obviously, it was seen as though it was like a Star Trek parody. It was because Seth MacFarlane was a big Star Trek fan. He wanted to be on Star Trek, so he created his own show in the model of Star Trek. And you would think of a lot of Seth MacFarlane property, Family Guy, being one of the big ones, slapstick comedy, like toilet humor, all that type of stuff. And also he's done, on Family Guy, he's done parody of Star Wars as well. So he's a big sci-fi guy. To me, this episode was a very different shift in tone because I ended up watching, I haven't watched the previous seasons yet, but I did go back to season 1, episode 1. And just the tone of it was very different. This iteration, the New Horizons iteration, is much different from the tone that was from the first two seasons I've seen. And so to me, it was very surprising in that way. And there's definitely a lot of layers to this story. We'll get to that in the spoiler part of the review. But yeah, I liked the episode very much in terms of the story, in terms of the presentation, in terms of the character building was very fascinating for a person that's new to this. So I would say definitely watch it just if you're intrigued about some Star Trek proxy. Definitely try to check it out on Hulu.
Yeah, so I come with the opposite experience. So I actually have seen the first 2 seasons, and I like the show. I don't think, let me restate that. I was going to say I don't think this is a great episode. It's a good episode. It's a really good episode. What is dragging it down for me is it's a little overlong. If you just watch the first episode of Orville and watch this episode, yes, the tone is completely different. But the episode that preceded this was like a giant intergalactic war, which you get into in this episode. So the tone, they figured out their tone by the middle of the first season, where comedic things happen, but they don't feel obligated to make jokes every minute, which is what the first episode is of the first episode of the first season. So it's funny when it has to be, but when they're talking about very serious things, which they are in this episode, they're talking about a very serious topic. They don't undercut the message of the episode by trying to make jokes about it, because it's a very serious thing. But I do think, like I said, the episode is a little self-indulgent in that it's an hour and it could have been 45 minutes. As I was watching it, I fell asleep in a portion that I know they could have cut. But that being said, it is buoyed by some really good messaging about mental health, really, without speaking about specifically what the mental health issue is here. So it's a very well-written episode in general. It just needed a few cuts in the editing room to trim it down, because I don't think it's necessary, especially some like extended sequences. Maybe think of some extended sequences in Star Trek: The Motion Picture where they're showing the ship, very loving photos of the ship. Yeah. But besides that, I think it was a good episode. I would probably give it a 7, maybe a 7.5 out of 10. So yeah, it was a good episode. It was a good start to the season. I would probably give it an 8 or 8.5 if it was trimmed down a little bit better, more. That's it, which would be like a great rating for an episode. Yeah, I liked it. Do you want to get into the spoiler talk, or do you want to? Is there anything else you wanted to say about the episode?
Yeah, I think we can just get into spoiler. I think, like you said, it's going to be a very interesting discussion because we come from different parts of it. As for me, it's you coming into it as a person that's already watched the first 2 seasons, so it's going to be very interesting to see the difference, and hopefully we can get into a very rich discussion about this.
Okay, cool. I will say, if you're enjoying the conversation, please comment down below to join the conversation. Also, like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of the summer, so we can bring you more diverse voices on this channel. We're trying to grow out our team, and we're doing that every weekend, and it's helped by subscribers, so we really appreciate that. All right, so spoilers ahead. Go see the episode. It's a good episode, even with my qualms about it being a little bit long. It's a good episode. All right, yes. Spoilers ahead. All right, what do you want to jump into? We don't have to do a point-by-point breakdown of the episode, but we can jump into some of the important bits, especially because, like I said, there's some things that could be cut out. So what do you want to talk about?
I think that there might be some questions about the context, because I know that the Kaylon is like the mortal enemy of the Terrans in this world. And just a question, maybe fill in some context as to what that is all about.
So Isaac was assigned to this ship ostensibly as part of an exchange. with the Kaylon people. The Kaylon people are a completely synthetic race. So ostensibly in the first episode of season 1, I think they talk about the fact that he's in exchange on the ship, and they do exchanges like this to learn about different species. But spoilers for season 2, that was subterfuge. This is how they learn about their enemies so they can attack them, because they were created by biological entities and they rose up against their makers and they killed them all. And they see biological life as a threat to their existence, so they try to snuff it out. But they use this subterfuge of they sent Isaac as an agent to gather information to aid them in their attack. But Isaac has his own sentience, and he went against his people during the last episode of season 2, and he helped save them from the attack. But as you saw in this episode, Ensign Charly Burke, as she's recounting here, the Kaylons killed thousands of people before they figured out how to push them back. So everyone hates him. Not everyone, but a lot of people hate him. A lot of people hate him. There's some people who don't hate him because they know that he could have made a different choice. He, like Data, has no emotions, apparently, but he also was in a relationship with the Doctor. And instead of doing that as like a one-off thing, like they did with Data, you remember he was in a relationship to gather information. He was in a relationship for an episode. They've had a long-term relationship. Their relationship lasted for several episodes, and she brought him into her life and her children's lives. So that's why she's very conflicted about what he did, because he could have killed not just her, but her children. And what he did kill a lot of people in not the Federation, the Union. They use a different in the Union. Yes. While he was deactivated for the entirety of the attack, or the majority of the attack, because he objected, they use all the data that he was collecting. They just downloaded all that information to help aid in their attack. So he knew why he was there, and he was hiding that, regardless of whether or not he had a change of heart. That was what was happening with him, or at least I think that was what was happening with him. Actually, I would have to go back and rewatch the last couple episodes. It's possible that he was unaware of his mission, but that was what his real mission was. It's possible that he was unaware of his mission. I have to go back and watch the episodes to see.
So in some ways, it's kind of like from DS9. Odo had a very similar story as a changeling. He basically betrayed his own people during the war. So yeah, there's a lot of Star Trek references that I really do appreciate that Seth MacFarlane really put into it. It's not obvious Star Trek references, but if you've seen some of the Star Trek episodes, you know that there's some iterations. And also, of course, those little slight references here and there, which is really interesting. And then the kids, you can probably see them as like Jake Sisko in some ways. So the older kid in some ways. Of course, there's some intonations, but you're not like, oh my God, it's like a direct carbon copy of it.
No, it's not a direct carbon copy. But what I will say is that when they started making new seasons of Trek, a lot of the creative team and a lot of the actors weren't asked back because they were trying to do a clean slate sort of thing, honoring the past, but not necessarily having the same creator. So Seth MacFarlane hired a bunch of the people from that era, that TNG era. So they work on this show. He's actually hired some of the actors. Like you said, one of the main casts that was Cassidy Yates in DS9. But I think Robert Picardo has showed up on this show, and some other people from that era has showed up on the show as well. And yeah, I appreciate him giving them jobs. But like a lot of the first 2 seasons seemed derivative. No, the first season seemed derivative. And then they started doing their own thing and started to create their own universe. So there are definitely riffs on certain things. Like Isaac is Odo, but Isaac is also Data. Spock to a certain extent, although he's ruder. Yeah. He's more rude than Spock. He calls the humans meatbags or something like that. Like he's rude, but not like in a malicious way, because he doesn't have emotion, so he doesn't have the ability to be malicious. He just doesn't regard humans as very smart at all, and he's blunt about it. So yeah, he's not as charming as Data, and he surprisingly has less tact than Odo when it comes to dealing with humans, which is probably not making him any friends, given that he turned out to be a spy. Right. Yeah,
and we saw that in the mess hall. One of the first scenes of the episode was that he was basically, what he was doing was that he relieved from his space, and they do maintenance, and then he went to the mess hall, and then they say, oh sure, you can sit with us, but then they all walked away. So from my perspective, I'm like, what the hell's going on? Because I didn't have any context as to what was going on.
Did you watch the first episode before watching this episode?
No, I actually went back. So I then he made I think the captain made the line about, oh, your whole people are all racist. So yeah, I was able to go back to at least the very first episode and get a little bit more context as to what was going on. But I assumed that a lot of the stuff that was a carryover, especially with Charly, a lot of it was from the previous season's episode, from episode season.
I will say that this show is more serialized than Strange New Worlds, which is the new Star Trek show that just came out, but it is less serialized than Discovery. So there are some episodes that run directly into one another, and the repercussions, there are definitely emotional stories that go from episode to episode, but they do have one-off episodes as well that don't necessarily connect with anything, except for what happens in those episodes affect the people, and if they're affected, that will go into the next episode, which is what they're doing with Strange New Worlds. Strange New Worlds, every episode is different, but the emotional impact for the people carries on to the next episode, which is not what they did in the TNG era. It's like they reset because they showed those episodes in syndication, and they couldn't really have anything go from episode to episode, except for the season finale running into the season premiere in the next season.
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting in that there's more, I don't know. I think that there's definitely some to have one-off episodes where you do have some emotional stakes involved, and then that emotional stake and that character building, the growth actually carries over. I think that's definitely very important. And it's just a different style. And in our reviews, we've been doing it's all in chronological. There's always some sort of order. So it's a nice kind of relief to see something that's a little bit different.
This is a little bit different, but if you watch the season premiere, you'd be completely lost. I feel like later on in the season, they might have some one-offs that you don't have to watch, but there's no way that you could, like the season finale, season 2 was crazy. There was a giant space battle, which you could see in some of the flashbacks. You saw the episode starts with a dream sequence from one of the kids, Marcus. Norman McDonald is the slug animal, so he died last year. That's what the tribute. So this is what the space battles looked like at the end of the last season, except for there was more. There was more going on.
He definitely took a little bit of liberty from the newer Star Trek, the J.J. Abrams Star Trek things with running down the hallways. Not necessarily running down the hallways, but like he took a little bit of that liberty as well. It's interesting there.
Yeah, you can also see they're definitely trying here, but you also can see that the budget of this show is not as high as the budget of any of the Star Trek shows. Like the set decoration is not as expensive inside, and the CG isn't as good outside either. But they're trying. So yeah, and they're taking everything serious. Like the uniforms, their division uniforms, their insignia, they're taking all that seriously. So yeah, I think they do have. I think even some of the prosthetic people came from the original Star Trek.
I'm sure because there's a lot of similarities.
The TNG Star Trek is in this show. So yeah,
especially Bortus.
He looks basically like a Klingon.
Yeah,
but he comes from a race that has only one gender.
I did see that. I did remember to see on YouTube the gag that he had in one of the episodes. I saw it randomly on YouTube where he was like sitting on his egg. So remember that one, very amusing.
Yeah. So that's what's up with Isaac. And in this episode, as we said, most people hate him. Most people are suspicious of him. This kid, Marcus, who probably spent more time around him in social settings than most people on the ship, is really upset with him because he was in a relationship with his mother. And even though Isaac doesn't have the ability to emote, he probably as a child became attached to him, so he feels betrayed. So yeah, I feel like this is the part, like one of the parts that I think they could have been cut out. Like this
part right here,
this entire flying around.
Yeah.
This is the part that could have been cut out.
I was expecting that they would be, if they were going to do that there was going to be some sort of malfunction where Gordon was going to be seriously hurt or something. No, it's just like some flying exercise. It's just some
flying around to show that she can do. You could cut that a lot. You could just say, okay, she can work in 4-dimensional space, and it comes up later when she has to save Isaac, but it could have been cut a lot.
Yeah, there wasn't any stakes in that, and I think that it took away from the story a lot because the things that he was trying to establish mystery that this happened, and then you would have thought that the mystery would continue if Gordon was seriously hurt, or I don't think they'll kill him off. I don't think that's going to happen. That he was seriously hurt unconscious or something like that, and that kind of added to the mystery of who this might be, the saboteur or this.
Exactly, because at this point we don't know who wrote Murderer, so it was a waste of time. Like a lot of Star Trek episodes have A and B plots, but the A and B plots actually do something. The fact that Gordon got to fly around isn't doing something. It's just it's unnecessary. And I think this whole sequence is like several minutes long. Yeah, so this could have been cut all the way down, maybe a minute. I'm still going through. I mean, and this is I'm jumping every 20 seconds. Like 3 shots are every 20 seconds. Like this that was a very long sequence that could have been excised from this episode. So then she finds out who it is, Marcus, and Marcus makes a good point. Like he's like, are you guys serious? This is BS. You're upset with me because of vandalism, and he killed thousands of people. He didn't directly kill thousands of people, but indirectly he did kill thousands. He killed thousands of people. Yeah, and then we have this conversation here where he basically says, "I wish you were dead," which causes him to make the decision, the very logical decision, as we hear at the end of the episode that he thought that the efficiency was being compromised by his presence.
This is a very fascinating thing, and when I watched it, when I saw him like after that interaction that he had with Marcus, I was like, is there really emotion there? Because to me, when I was watching, I was like, there is emotion there.
It does seem like he has emotion.
There's emotion.
Just like sometimes when you saw Data in the original show, it seemed like sometimes he would have an emotional response. Especially if you go back to, so this is when he's about to kill himself, but if you go back to just before this, after he starts to speak to Marcus, he basically is staring out of this window, like whimsically, just thinking to himself. And it seems like there was an emotional reaction to what Marcus said. And the doctor even says in this episode that she was never convinced that he had no emotion. So maybe at some point we're going to find out that he's evolved in an emotional capacity or something like that later on in the season.
Yeah, even you could tell by I think that this is brilliant from the part of the director. I think
Seth MacFarlane directed it and he wrote this.
Yeah, anyway. So I think it was brilliant of him to either the tone, the camera angles, just to show him in terms of him walking slow. It just gave the audience the impression that he was emoting and he did feel bad that this happened and that he made that decision because of what Marcus said to him. So it's really well done in that regard to see that, yeah, this is ascension. Not that this is just ascension. It's like there's some emotion there and you could really feel for Isaac as well. But on the other hand, it's a very good counterpoint to what Charly's experiencing as well, because we saw a flashback of friend Amanda sacrificing herself. So like you can definitely see that gray area, that side of, and how Gordon also made that interaction with her and say, I'm with you on that.
He's not being disrespectful to his fellow crewmate. He's not going to take it to her extreme, or like he says that he agrees with her, but he's not going to live with bitterness because that's just going to make him unhappy. But she wants to live in that pain because I guess it was her best friend or whatever. But yeah.
But then it's interesting that Ed then said something about you don't take all the ownership of all the grief, and that was a very powerful line. I had to admit, I was like, wow, let's get it together.
She doesn't have a monopoly on grief. She's an ensign, so I mean, she's young, so maybe that. Yeah. But yeah, I appreciate how they staged this whole scene here, his suicide, because it was obvious what he was doing. It wasn't clear until the middle part, and he was like, is he going to kill himself? Is he going to kill himself? And then the last thing that he says is that I offer my best wishes to the Finn family. It was a letter, which is a very personal, has nothing to do with his duties thing, and then he tries to commit suicide. So yeah, I do appreciate that for the majority of this episode. I thought they were going to actually stick with the decision. There's also other things going on in this episode that don't have anything to do with the main plot, but I guess it's just like the background stuff. I have less of an issue with the fact that Malloy is refitting the ship in Space Dock, but there's a lot of scenes of Malloy refitting the ship in Space Dock. I feel like these scenes could have also been cut down a little bit as well to focus more on the Isaac stuff. And here's the thing, like, all this stuff is nice to have in the background because those are the things that happen on a ship, but it takes away from the main plot. Now, if the main plot wasn't as serious as the main plot is, if we weren't talking about suicide and we weren't talking about mental health and we weren't talking about people trying to recover from a lot of grief, then sure, have some of this random stuff, this random ship operation stuff. But the fact that they have all this random ship operation stuff in the middle of this episode where we're talking about this very serious issue, which is handled very well, it reduces the impact of the story they're trying to tell. So,
yeah, I get what you're saying, Nathan, is that I think that definitely took you away, especially the ship scene and also the ship maintenance and repair. I get it. We're in like Space Dock right now. So these things do have to happen. But yeah, you don't need to focus that much onto it unless maybe they're just trying to say a ship is very complicated thing to run. And
it's not integral to the plot. I don't need to know how the specifics of how this made up ship runs because it's all made up anyway. Unless I need to know some made up information for the plot of this episode, don't waste my time on this stuff.
Yeah, they could probably do like a technical manual of the org. People like us can read it on our spare time. We want to really dive into the technical, because it's funny because they had something like this on for Star Trek, for TNG with the Enterprise. They had a technical manual, and it's like, you want to learn more about that, you could just go to the book and learn more about it instead of putting it into the plot.
Yeah, unless the stuff that they're talking about is related to the plot of the episode, unless it has to do with the main point of the episode. And the main point of this episode is Isaac's suicide. So yeah, I think there's a lot of good scenes in here with how everyone is dealing with it. So Marcus, of course, blames himself. The doctor, very torn because she was in a relationship with him. She had feelings for him. She's still trying to reconcile whether or not she loved him still, given what he did. Because she says in this scene with the first officer that she was trying to turn off her feelings for him for so long, and now she doesn't know how she feels now that he's gone. But yeah, I appreciate all this stuff, this conversation with her, the funeral scene, that stuff is great. The fact that they show some wide angle shots of the funeral scene, you can see that there's a lot of empty seats in this funeral, was really good. Marcus not sure whether or not he wants to show up to the funeral. All this stuff was good, and all this stuff I think is the main guts of this episode, which they should have focused more on. Is that they shouldn't have pulled focus away, is what I meant to say. I actually thought here, I thought this was going to be a fake out, like she gave him a lecture about using Isaac as a crutch, and then she was going to use Isaac as a crutch. But if you go back to, I think, season 2, when they get into a relationship, the name of this thing that she starts up has his name on it, but it's because he created it. It's not a simulation of him. I think it was just he created it for their date. So she's trying to connect with her feelings in what she thinks is a healthy way.
Right.
So this scene was also very good, especially if you saw the second season when they got together. Yeah, this stuff is the stuff that can be cut. Yeah, they finish the shakedown, and now they're going to go off, and then they get attacked by some of his people, actually. And I thought that's when they were going to bring him back. But they get out of the situation without him. But because they get out of the situation without him, I feel like all that stuff could have been cut. This bedroom scene, some of this, but some of this is good, some of it could have been cut. Some of this is in here because this is supposed to be a comedy, so all that stuff about him being very good about sex, I guess, is the comedic part, but it also could have been cut to focus on what she was talking about, which
I think it's just banter. It's just good banter back and forth. I think I didn't have too much of a problem with it. I just think that, sometimes when you do have the banter in the bedroom, you do come up with some definitely serious topics, and I think that they did a pretty good job of balancing it, I would say. I didn't really have too much of problem with it.
Yeah, and she does give her perspective from her culture, which was useful for. Actually, it wasn't necessarily useful for him to solve the issue, but it was useful for him to see a different point of view. And also, I think the point of it was to show the audience a different point of view. But he was also very dismissive of her culture, and which is weird. You don't necessarily see that. You don't necessarily see that in the Federation, but you do see it in the Union a lot. People are not as everyone's culture is great. They question each other people's cultures a lot. Yeah, he wasn't. He was taking in what she said, but he didn't necessarily agree with her about suicide. And quite frankly, there are cultures on this planet that we live on who are human who have a very similar view of suicide. I know the Scandinavian cultures that have, I don't know about being plucked from the void, that's specific to this show or whatever, it's made up race, but people in other cultures on this planet respect other human beings' decision to take their lives.
And even in this country, we've had some controversy about that.
I actually remember having to do debates in high school about assisted suicide because around the time I was in high school, I think Oregon or Washington had an assisted suicide law put into place. So yeah, it's not as cut as dry as everyone except for her is presenting it. She's presenting it as a very logical choice. And Isaac, when he is revived, presents it as a very logical choice as well. And a choice that someone should be able to make. But I think the majority of the episode is trying to tell you not necessarily how to feel about someone making that decision, but how to cope with your feelings if they make this decision.
So I think in this way, they did a very good job. Again, Seth MacFarlane wrote this. I think he did a very good job of putting in, as I mentioned in the non-spoiler part, of these layers, of these type of layers in terms of debates, in terms of grief, in terms of reactions to it, in terms of even how Charly felt after Isaac did commit suicide. How did she feel? How did she feel about that? How did Marcus feel about that? The effects of what he said. So I think that there's these multiple layers that I did appreciate. Yes, given the tone was very serious as well, which I didn't expect actually, because I thought it would be kind of like more like season 1, where it was like, a little bit over the top, a little bit of twirly humor, and it wasn't like that. And I was like, wow, this is surprising in a lot of.
And they treat the situation with the respect that it deserves, apart from, like I said, where they could have trimmed a bit.
But yeah, I just felt as though despite the fact that he was doing a lot of that maintenance stuff and here and there, I think that he did very serious, complex issue, mental health and suicide. I think he did do a good job of taking it very seriously, knowing the nuances and really examining the nuances between the characters and how they play it all out. And it leaves a lot of, again, open discussion as to like how we would, or how different types of people would see this, see the reaction to it, see the debate around it and the discussion about it. So it's all very well done in a lot of ways. And I think that's why my you said it was a 7.5. Now that's why I gave it a higher grade, probably around an 8.5 because of that. That's why, that's how.
Yeah, like I said, it would have gotten an 8.5 from me if it was cut down to just focus on what it was focusing on. It lowered a little bit because it's a little self-indulgent because he's on a streaming service. If he had to cut this for Fox when he was on Fox, I think it would have been a better episode. If he had the restrictions of it having to be shown on television, he would have cut it down where he needed to cut it down, and it would have been an exceptional episode. Sometimes giving someone more time to do something doesn't give you a better result. So that's why I said it would have packed more of a punch for me if it was cut down a little bit. But it was still a very good episode. It's still a very good episode. And even Charly at the end making the decision to help because of her conversation with Marcus, she never really changes her mind about Isaac. She just wants to relieve some of the pain that Marcus is feeling, or some of the guilt that Marcus is feeling, because he was the last one to speak to Isaac before he made that decision. But even in the conversation with Marcus, she says that you don't necessarily wish anyone to take their life, but Marcus asks her if you're glad, and she says that she's glad. So she it's going to be interesting whether or not she continues in the season, this Ensign, and she continues in the season with Isaac around, because the doctor says that people's impressions will change with time. That scene was also written very well, with the doctor debriefing and trying to do a session with Isaac. He lays out why he did what he did, which again, very logical reasons for why he did what he did from his perspective. But her point about, that you're making a permanent decision without future knowledge. You don't have future knowledge, and there's no problem that can't be solved with time. Even though this episode spends some time talking about the issue from different points of view, it definitely has a point of view that this is not something someone should do. And I think specifically within the context of this show and what we're talking about, I think that's a fine and valid point of view to have. We're not talking about an elderly person. We're not talking about someone with a degenerative disease. We're talking about someone who made a decision because they thought that, from a certain perspective, you can see someone make a decision because people hate him, and he thinks that people would be better off without him. And that's a lot of what people say when they make this decision. And from that perspective, yes, I think that them taking a definitive point of view on this episode that what he did was wrong and that what he did was very short-sighted is a good and a responsible way to go with this episode.
Absolutely. No, I agree. I agree with that they did send the right message. And I think that was definitely relayed during the therapy session that he had near the end of the episode, where the doctor was basically saying, that you can't really measure that. You can't really have there's not a definitive amount of time in which, you can make a determination on it.
Yeah, he's making decisions with data that he has, but he doesn't have future data.
Correct.
So
Correct. Exactly.
Yeah. So I think it was well done, and it was written in a way that it's plausible that he would see her insight and also see her logic, because the concern is that he'll try to do it again, because he even says in the session that he's going to do it again, because based on his analysis, and he thinks his analysis was correct, that he doesn't think his presence is conducive to the crew. So it was good to have that in there, that whole session in there with him. This episode ends with Marcus still being ambivalent towards him. He's happy that he's alive, but he doesn't go and speak to him. He looks at him basically from afar. He's still ambivalent about how he feels about him, which is, I think, more realistic, right? What he did was what he did. Marcus knows now that he doesn't want him dead, but he doesn't know how he feels about him. It's not like he's, I want him back in my life. He just doesn't want him dead, and he feels regretful that he said what he said, which is what he said to the Ensign, that I did hate. I think specifically what Marcus says is that I did hate him, but I didn't want him to die, which is what makes her make her decision.
Yeah, absolutely. But like I said, I think overall, definitely very layered, definitely different perspectives, and also from the standpoint of a teenager like Marcus. I'm with teenagers a lot because of what I do as an educator, and you can definitely see that there are feelings like that. And I try to remind them words do matter, and also words do hurt, whether they are directed at your classmates or even at adults. So it was a reminder for myself as well, in terms of how I would react and interact and have these teachable moments with the young people that I interact with on a daily basis. So it's really interesting, and from that standpoint on how to react to that. And sometimes we are human and we react in very negative ways, but at the same time, taking a step back and giving a perspective that's a little bit more measured and a little bit, but also, again, like I said, teachable moments so that they can learn and grow from it. Yeah.
Anything else that you wanted to cover in this episode? I think we talked about pretty much all we talked about this conversation with Marcus and her, and we talked about the debrief with the doctor at the end. And I don't know where we leave off here. Is Marcus, like I said, ambivalent about where?
And I think that's going to carry over through the next few episodes, and you might see a point where Ensign Burke and also Marcus might feel a little bit differently as time heals all wounds. So hopefully throughout the season we get to kind of
right?
Yeah, exactly. And whether or not there's some type of setup where Isaac is going to be a very significant part in how they might change their views, or they might not even change their views. So who knows?
All right. That's what we think, but we want to hear what you guys think. So please comment down below, like and subscribe to get more content like this, and we will be back next week with the next episode. All right, guys. Bye. Thanks.